Chapter 4, Part 1 of The Quest of the Historical Jesus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Quest of the Historical Jesus by Albert Schweitzer, translated by William Montgomery. Chapter 4, Part 1. The Earliest Fictitious Lives of Jesus. Bibliography. Carl Friedrich Barth. Popular Letters about the Bible, a weekly paper by a country clergyman. Halle, 1782, 816 pages. An explanation of the plans and aims of Jesus, in letters addressed to readers who seek the truth. 11 volumes embracing 3,000 pages. Berlin, 1784 through 1792. This work is a sequel to the Popular Letters about the Bible. The whole of the discourses of Jesus extracted from the Gospels. Berlin, 1786. Karl Heinrich Venturini, A Non-Supernatural History of the Great Prophet of Nazareth. Copenhagen, first edition, 1800 through 1802, second edition, 1806. 4 volumes embracing 2,700 pages. The work appeared anonymously. The description given below is based on the second edition, which shows dependence, in some of the exegetical details, upon the then recently published commentaries of Paulus. It is strange to notice how often in the history of our subject a few imperfectly equipped freelances have attacked and attempted to carry the decisive positions before the ordered ranks of professional theology have pushed their advance to these decisive points. Thus, it was the fictitious lives of Barth and Venturini which, at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th centuries, first attempted to apply, with logical consistency, the non-supernatural interpretation to the miracle stories of the Gospel. Further, these writers were the first who, instead of contenting themselves with the simple reproduction of the successive sections of the gospel narrative, endeavored to grasp the inner connection of cause and effect in the events and experiences of the life of Jesus. Since they found no such connection indicated in the Gospels, they had to supply it for themselves. The particular form which their explanation takes, the hypothesis of a secret society of which Jesus is the tool, is, it is true, rather a sorry makeshift. Yet, in a sense, these lives of Jesus, for all their coloring of fiction, are the first which deserve the name. The rationalists, and even Paulus, confine themselves to describing the teaching of Jesus. Barth and Venturini make a bold attempt to paint the portrait of Jesus himself. It is not surprising that their portraiture is at once crude and fantastic, like the earliest attempts of art to represent the human figure in living movement. Carl Friedrich Barth was born in 1741 at Biskopswerda. Endowed with brilliant abilities, he made, owing to a bad upbringing and an undisciplined sensuous nature, a miserable failure. After being first catechist and afterwards professor extraordinary of sacred philology at Leipzig, he was, in 1766, requested to resign on account of his scandalous life. After various adventures, and after holding for a time a professorship at Gießen, he received, under Friedrich's minister Zedlitz, authorization to lecture at Halle. There, he lectured to nearly 900 students who were attracted by his inspiring eloquence. The government upheld him in spite of his serious failings, with a double motive of annoying the faculty and maintaining the freedom of learning. After the death of Frederick the Great, Barth had to resign his post and took to keeping an inn and a vineyard near Halle. By ridiculing Wollner's edict in 1788, he brought on himself a year of confinement in a fortress. He died in disrepute in 1792. Barth had begun as an Orthodox cleric. In Halle, he gave up his belief in revelation, and endeavored to explain religion on the ground of reason. To this period belong the popular letters about the Bible, which were afterwards continued in the further series, An Explanation of the Plans and Aims of Jesus. His treatment of the life of Jesus has been too severely censured. The work is not without passages which show a real depth of feeling, especially in the continually recurring explanations regarding the relation of belief in miracle to true faith, in which the actual description of the life of Jesus lies embedded. And the remarks about the teaching of Jesus are not always commonplace. But the paraphernalia of dialogues of portentous length make it, as a whole, formless and inartistic. The introduction of a galaxy of imaginary characters, Haram, Shema, Avel, Lima, and the like, is nothing less than bewildering. Barth finds the key to the explanation of the life of Jesus in the appearance in the gospel narrative of Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. They are not disciples of Jesus, but belong to the upper classes. What role, then, can they have played in the life of Jesus, and how came they to intercede on his behalf? They were Essenes. This order had secret members in all ranks of society, even in the Sanhedrin. It had set itself the task of detaching the nation from the sensuous messianic hopes, and leading it to a higher knowledge of spiritual truths. It had the most widespread ramifications, extending to Babylon and to Egypt. In order to deliver the people from the limitations of the national faith, which could only lead to disturbance and insurrection, they must find a Messiah who would destroy these false messianic expectations. They were therefore on the lookout for a claimant of the Messiahship whom they could make subservient to their aims. Jesus came under the notice of the order immediately after his birth. As a child, he was watched over at every step by the brethren. At the feasts of Jerusalem, Alexandrian Jews, secret members of the Essene order, put themselves into communication with him, explained to him the falsity of the priests, inspired him with a horror of the bloody sacrifices of the temple, and made him acquainted with Socrates and Plato. This is set forth in dialogues of 100 pages long. At the story of the death of Socrates, the boy bursts into a tempest of sobs which his friends are unable to calm. He longs to emulate the martyr death of the great Athenian. On the marketplace at Nazareth, a mysterious Persian gives him 2 sovereign remedies, one for affections of the eye, the other for nervous disorders. His father does the best for him, teaching him, along with his cousin John, afterwards the Baptist, about virtue and immortality. A priest belonging to the Essene order, who makes their acquaintance disguised as a shepherd, and takes part in their conversations, leads the lads deeper into the knowledge of wisdom. At 12 years old, Jesus is already so far advanced that he argues with the scribes in the temple concerning miracles, maintaining the thesis that they are impossible. When they feel themselves ready to appear in public, the 2 cousins take counsel together how they can best help the people. They agree to open the eyes of the people regarding the tyranny and hypocrisy of the priests. Through Haram, a prominent member of the Essene order, Luke the physician is introduced to Jesus and places all his sciences at his disposal. In order to produce any effect, they were obliged to practice accommodation to the superstitions of the people, and introduce their wisdom to them under the garb of folly, in the hope that, beguiled by its attractive exterior, the people would admit into their minds the revelation of rational truth, and after a time be able to emancipate themselves from superstition. Jesus, therefore, sees himself obliged to appear in the role of the Messiah of popular expectation, and to make up his mind to work by means of miracles and illusions. About this he felt the gravest scruples. He was obliged, however, to obey the order, and his scruples were quieted by the remainder of the lofty end which was to be reached by these means. At last, when it is pointed out to him that even Moses had followed the same plan, he submits to the necessity. The influential order undertakes the duty of stage managing the miracles, and that of maintaining his father. On the reception of Jesus into the number of the brethren of the first degree of the order, it is made known to him that these brethren are bound to face death in the cause of the order, but that the order, on its part, undertakes so to use the machinery and influence at its disposal, that the last extremity shall always be avoided, and the brother mysteriously preserved from death. Then begins the cleverly staged drama by means of which the people are to be converted to rational religion. The members of the order are divided into three classes: the baptized, the disciples, the chosen ones. The baptized receive only the usual popular teaching. The disciples are admitted to further knowledge, but are not entrusted with the highest mysteries. The chosen ones, who in the Gospels are spoken of as angels, are admitted into all wisdom. As the apostles were only members of the second degree, they had not the smallest suspicion of the secret machinery which was at work. Their part in the drama of the life of Jesus was that of zealous supers. The Gospels which they composed therefore report, in perfect good faith, miracles which were really clever illusions produced by the Essenes, and they depict the life of Jesus only as seen by the populace from the outside. It is therefore not always possible for us to discover how the events which they record as miracles actually came about. But whether they took place in one way or another, and as to this we can sometimes get a clue from a hint in the text, it is certain that in all cases the process was natural. With reference to the feeding of the 5,000, Barth remarks, quote, "It is more reasonable here to think of 1,000 ways by which Jesus might have had sufficient supplies of bread at hand, and by the distribution of it have shamed his disciples' lack of courage, than to believe in a miracle." Close quote. The explanation which he himself prefers is that the order had collected a great quantity of bread in a cave, and this was gradually handed out to Jesus, who stood at the concealed entrance, and took some every time the apostles were occupied in distributing the former supply to the multitude. The walking on the sea is to be explained by supposing that Jesus walked towards the disciples over the surface of a great floating raft, while they, not being able to see the raft, must needs suppose a miracle. When Peter tried to walk on the water, he failed miserably. The miracles of healing are to be attributed to the art of Luke. He also called the attention of Jesus to remarkable cases of apparent death, which he then took in hand, and restored the apparently dead to their sorrowing friends. In such cases, however, the Lord never failed expressly to inform the disciples that the persons were not really dead. They, however, did not permit this assurance to deprive them of their faith in the miracle, which they felt they had themselves witnessed. In teaching, Jesus had two methods: one, exoteric, simple, for the world; the other, esoteric, mystic, for the initiate. Says Barth, quote, "No attentive reader of the Bible can fail to notice that Jesus made use of two different styles of speech. Sometimes he spoke so plainly and in such universally intelligible language, and declared truths so simple and so well adapted to the general comprehension of mankind, that even the simplest could follow him. At other times he spoke so mystically, so obscurely, and in so veiled a fashion, that words and thoughts alike baffled the understandings of ordinary people, and even by more practiced minds were not to be grasped without close reflection, so that we are told in John 6, verse 60, that many of his disciples, when they heard this, said, "This is an hard saying, who can hear it?" And Jesus himself did not deny it, but only told them that the reason of their not understanding his sayings lay in their prejudices, which made them interpret everything literally and materially, and overlook the ethical meaning which underlay his figurative language. Close quote. Most of these mystical discourses are to be found in John, who seems to have preserved for us the greater part of the secret teaching imparted to the initiate. The key to the understanding of this esoteric teaching is to be found, therefore, in the prologue to John's Gospel, and in the sayings about the new birth. To be born again is identical with the degree of perfection which was attained in the highest class of the brotherhood. The members of the order met on appointed days in caves among the hills. When we are told in the Gospels that Jesus went alone into a mountain to pray, this means that he repaired to one of these secret gatherings. But the disciples, of course, knew nothing about that. The order had its hidden caves everywhere, in Galilee as well as in the neighborhood of Jerusalem. Quote, "Only by sensuous means can sensuous ideas be overcome." Close quote. The Jewish Messiah must die and rise again, in order that the false conceptions of the Messiah which were cherished by the multitude might be destroyed in the moment of their fulfillment, that is, might be spiritualized. Nicodemus, Hermann, and Luke met in a cave in order to take counsel how they might bring about the death of Jesus in a way favorable to their plans. Luke guaranteed that by the aid of powerful drugs which he would give him, the Lord should be enabled to endure the utmost pain and suffering, and yet resist death for a long time. Nicodemus undertook so to work matters in the Sanhedrin that the execution should follow immediately upon the sentence, and the crucified remain only a short time upon the cross. At this moment Jesus rushed into the cave. He had scarcely had time to replace the stone which concealed the entrance, so closely he had been pursued over the rocks by hired assassins. He himself is firmly resolved to die, but care must be taken that he shall not be simply assassinated, or the whole plan fails. If he falls by the assassin's knife, no resurrection will be possible. In the end, the piece is staged to perfection. Jesus provokes the authorities by his triumphal messianic entry. The unsuspected Essenes in the council urge on his arrest and secure his condemnation, though Pilate almost frustrates all their plans by acquitting him. Jesus, by uttering a loud cry and immediately afterwards bowing his head, shows every appearance of a sudden death. The centurion has been bribed not to allow any of his bones to be broken. Then comes Joseph of Ramath, as Barth prefers to call Joseph of Arimathea, and removes the body to the cave of the Essenes, where he immediately commences measures of resuscitation. As Luke had prepared the body of the Messiah by means of strengthening medicines to resist the fearful ill usage which he had gone through, the being dragged about and beaten and finally crucified, these efforts were crowned with success. In the cave, the most strengthening nutrient was supplied to him. Quote, "Since the humors of his body were in a thoroughly healthy condition, his wounds healed very readily, and by the third day he was able to walk, in spite of the fact that the wounds made by the nails were still open." Close quote. On the morning of the third day, they forced away the stone which closed the mouth of the grave. As Jesus was descending the rocky slopes, the watch awakened and took to flight in alarm. One of the Essenes appeared, in the garb of an angel, to the women and announced to them the resurrection of Jesus. Shortly afterwards, the Lord appeared to Mary. At the sound of his voice, she recognizes him. Quote, "Thereupon, Jesus tells her that he is going to his Father, to heaven, in the mystic sense of the word, that is to say, to the chosen ones in their peaceful dwellings of truth and blessedness, to the circle of his faithful friends, among whom he continued to live, unseen by the world, but still working for the advancement of his purpose. He bade her tell his disciples that he was alive." Close quote. From his place of concealment, he appeared several times to his disciples. Finally, he bade them meet him at the Mount of Olives, near Bethany, and there took leave of them. After exhorting them, and embracing each of them in turn, he tore himself away from them and walked away up the mountain. Quote, "There stood those poor men, amazed, beside themselves with sorrow, and looked after him as long as they could. But as he mounted higher, he entered ever deeper into the cloud which lay upon the hilltop, until finally he was no longer to be seen. The cloud received him out of their sight." From the mountain he returned to the chief lodge of the brotherhood. Only at rare intervals did he again intervene in active life, as on the occasion when he appeared to Paul upon the road to Damascus. But, though unseen, he continued to direct the destinies of the community until his death. End of chapter 4, part 1.